The mud was the first thing that killed them. Not the arrows, not the English blades, not the chaos that would consume the morning of October 25th, 1415. The mud came first, silent and patient, waiting beneath the freshly plowed fields of northern France, like a trap no general had thought to account for. It had been raining for weeks. The kind of rain that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply refuses to stop, soaking everything, turning the earth into something between soil and quicksand. The French army, encamped in massive numbers on those same fields, had churned the ground into a thick, ankle-deep paste of dark earth and water. They had camped there for days, tens of thousands of men and horses grinding the soil into nothing. When the time came to advance, they would have to walk through it. Every step would cost something. They just didn't know yet how much. On the other side of that field stood a man who, by most reasonable calculations, had no business still being alive. Henry V of England, 27 years old, had led an army across the English Channel months earlier with grand ambitions and a firm belief in a claim to the French throne that was, at best, legally dubious, and at worst, entirely manufactured. He had besieged the city of Harfleur, taken it after a brutal 5-week campaign, and then made a decision that his closest advisors thought bordered on madness. Instead of wintering in the newly captured port, he announced he would march his army northeast toward Calais, a march of roughly 260 miles through hostile French territory with winter approaching, and his men already weakened by the dysentery that had torn through the camp at Harfleur like a second siege. The march had been an ordeal that tested every man who survived it. Food was scarce, the men were exhausted. Disease had already killed hundreds and incapacitated hundreds more. By the time the English army found its path blocked at the Somme River, they had been marching for weeks, and the mood had turned from grim determination to something darker. The French had demolished the bridges and flooded the crossings, forcing the English to move inland, away from their destination, burning precious time and energy. When they finally crossed the Somme at a ford near Agincourt, the men were so weakened that soldiers were collapsing during the march. Many had dysentery so severe they had cut out the seats of their breeches entirely, unable to stop long enough for any dignity. They were a ragged, sick, hungry column of around 6,000 men moving through a country that wanted them dead. And waiting for them was France. The French had mobilized an army that the chronicles of the time described with numbers that modern historians debate, but generally place somewhere between 12,000 and 36,000 men, with a reasonable estimate clustering around 15 to 20,000 combatants, though some accounts go higher. Whatever the exact figure, it dwarfed the English force so completely that even the most optimistic English knight would have struggled to find comfort in the comparison. The French army was composed largely of the cream of French nobility. These were men who had trained their entire lives for this exact moment, armored knights and men-at-arms, carrying the weight of generations of military tradition. They had every advantage. They had the numbers, they had the rested horses, they had the food, they had the home soil beneath their feet, and they had the certainty that comes from believing a victory is so inevitable it barely qualifies as a fight. The night before the battle, the contrast between the two camps could not have been more striking. The French side was reportedly loud with celebration, with knights gambling over which English prisoners they would take and what ransoms those prisoners might yield. This was not entirely unreasonable from their perspective. Capturing English nobility alive was more profitable than killing them, and the prospect of ransoming a king was something that occupied French minds with particular enthusiasm. Henry V would be worth an extraordinary sum. There are accounts of French heralds and knights openly discussing the division of the expected spoils, parceling out English lords among themselves before a single blow had been struck. The mood was festive, boisterous, almost contemptuous. These were men who had already won the battle in their imaginations. The English camp was quieter. There is a famous account, repeated by Shakespeare centuries later, and probably containing more truth than fiction, that Henry moved through his camp that night in disguise, walking among his men and listening to them speak. What he would have heard was fear. Not the paralyzing kind, but the kind that honest men admit to each other in the darkness when morning is coming, and morning carries something terrible inside it. Soldiers knelt and prayed. Priests moved through the camp giving absolution. Men who had been fighting each other over rations the day before made peace with old grudges. Some wrote letters that they knew might be the last words their families received. The English army understood its situation with remarkable clarity. They were sick, outnumbered, exhausted, and a long way from home. Many of them had not eaten properly in days. The road to Calais ran directly through an army that could swallow them whole. Henry himself, by old contemporary accounts, was extraordinary in these hours. He was not a man who inspired by spectacle or by theatrical speeches alone. He inspired by presence, by a kind of absolute certainty that radiated from him in ways that hardened men who had seen real war and knew what it cost. He had been fighting since he was a teenager. At the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, when he was only 16 years old, he had taken an arrow directly in the face. Not a glancing blow, not a wound to the arm or the shoulder. An arrow in the face, buried several inches into his skull near the eye. A royal surgeon had spent 2 hours extracting it, using a specially designed instrument. Most men would have died from the wound alone. Many would have been disfigured and broken by the experience. Henry had returned to battle. The scar was there on his face for any man to see, and every man who followed him knew exactly what it meant. This was not a king who sent others to die while he watched from a safe distance. The morning of October 25th arrived under a sky that offered no encouragement. The field between the two armies stretched roughly 1,000 yards, narrow enough that the French could not easily deploy their massive numerical advantage. The terrain was bordered by dense woods on both sides, compressing the battlefield into something that would limit the French ability to maneuver. Henry had chosen his position with care. The English line was set up across the narrow end of this funnel, their backs toward Agincourt village. In front of them, across that churned and waterlogged field, the French army had arranged itself in a formation that reflected both its enormous size and a certain overconfidence in the outcome. The vanguard alone, the 1st Division, probably outnumbered the entire English force. The English formation was a study in what military theorists would later call combined arms, though the men who stood in it would not have used such language. At the center, dismounted men-at-arms and knights stood in tight formations, armored heavily, carrying swords, axes, and polearms. On the flanks, and this was the crucial element, stood the archers. English and Welsh longbowmen, trained from childhood, capable of drawing bows with a pull weight that modern athletes would struggle to match even in their prime. These were not soldiers who had picked up a bow recently. They had been drawing bows since they were boys, and the skeletal remains of medieval English archers found by archaeologists show bones deformed by the repetitive stress of a lifetime of practice. Their left arms were often longer than their right. Their spines showed asymmetrical development. They were, in the most literal physical sense, built for this single purpose. Each one carried arrows by the sheaf, 24 to a bundle, and could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, with enough accuracy to hit a target at over 200 yards. Multiply that rate across several thousand archers, and the numbers become almost incomprehensible. In the single minute, at peak rate, the English longbowmen could put tens of thousands of arrows into the air, but for a long time, nothing happened. The two armies faced each other across the field in a standoff that stretched for hours into the morning. Henry needed the French to advance, because if his weakened men had to cross that entire field under their own power, they would arrive at the French lines already spent. The French, for their part, seemed content to wait. There were those among the French commanders who understood the tactical situation clearly enough to counsel patience. If the English advanced, they would tire crossing the field. If the English retreated, they could be pursued and destroyed piecemeal. Either way, France seemed to hold the winning hand. There was no urgency. Time favored the larger, better-fed, better-rested army. Henry made a decision that required a particular kind of courage. The courage not of charging into battle, but of doing something that looks, from the outside, like a provocation that might get everyone killed. He ordered his army to advance, not at a run, not recklessly, but in a controlled move forward, maintaining formation until they were within longbow range of the French lines. This was roughly 250 yards. His archers drove sharpened stakes into the ground in front of their positions, angled outward to discourage cavalry charges, and then they waited. The whole army waited, and then, on Henry's order, the archers began. What happened next is one of the most discussed and analyzed minutes in the history of medieval warfare. The French, confronted with an English army that had advanced and now stood in arrow range, could no longer afford to wait. Their cavalry on the wings was ordered forward. The horses, bred and trained for war, but still ultimately animals responding to pain and fear, came forward across that plowed, waterlogged field. The archers began loosing. Thousands of arrows went up and came down in the shallow, arcing trajectories that the longbow's flat pole enabled at close range. Horses were hit, not all of them, not immediately, but enough. A horse hit by an arrow does not stop. It panics, it veers, it collides with the horses beside it. The narrow battlefield, those woods pressing in on both sides, turned the cavalry charge into a compression disaster. Horses that had been wounded tried to turn back and ran into the horses still coming forward. Some wheeled sideways and crashed into the French infantry formations that were now also beginning their advance. The cavalry attack, which should have been a thundering, overwhelming force that smashed into the English flanks and rolled them up, became instead a source of additional chaos inflicted directly on the French army itself. The French infantry advance was already suffering before the cavalry disaster added to it. Thousands of men in heavy plate armor, some of the most expensive and technically sophisticated personal protection that medieval craftsmen could produce, moving on foot across a field of ankle-deep mud, were discovering the particular cruelty of that terrain. Every step required effort that no commander had accounted for. Plate armor, a full harness of the period, weighed between 45 and 60 pounds. Modern tests with replica armor have shown that a fit, trained man can move and fight in plate armor with reasonable effectiveness on dry, solid ground. In deep mud, the calculation changes entirely. Each step in which a foot sinks into that clinging earth and must be pulled free costs energy. The men at the front of the French advance were exhausted before they covered half the distance to the English lines. Some fell and could not easily rise. Those behind them kept coming, pressing forward, and the compression began. The arrows kept falling. The mathematics of it were merciless. The French were packed together by the narrowing terrain, moving slowly, unable to dodge or disperse, and the arrow storm was continuous. Visors had been lowered on helmets, which reduced visibility dramatically. Gaps between armor pieces, the armpits, the back of the knees, the groin, the visor slits themselves were the targets that skilled archers aimed for at closer ranges. Men began to fall. Not all of them killed outright, many wounded in the legs or feet, unable to continue forward but unable to easily retreat, went down in the mud and were trampled by the men behind them. The formation that had looked so impressive from a distance was compressing into a mass of exhausted, partially blinded, partially deafened men stumbling forward through bodies and mud toward an enemy line that by the time they reached it had rested and waited, and was fresh by comparison. When the lines finally met, it was less a clash of equal forces than a collision between men who could barely stand and men who had spent the morning watching and waiting. The English men-at-arms, Henry himself among them, fighting on foot in the front line, according to multiple contemporary accounts, went forward into the mass of French with weapons suited for close-quarter work. Axes, mallets, swords used as bludgeons. Men in plate armor once knocked down in that mud had enormous difficulty rising. The weight of the armor, combined with the suction of the earth, made a fallen man almost helpless. English soldiers moved through the press, cutting down those still standing and killing the fallen. It was brutal work, close and exhausting, and without any of the glory that the French knights had imagined the night before when they were dividing up their anticipated prisoners. There was a moment, roughly in the middle of the battle, when Henry received news that sent a cold shock through the English command. A French force, reportedly led by local knights and including servants and camp followers, had attacked the English baggage train from the rear, killing the boys left to guard it, and creating what appeared to be a second front opening up behind the main engagement. At nearly the same moment, a large body of French troops, the 3rd Division that had not yet committed to the battle, was seen moving as if preparing to attack. Henry faced a nightmare scenario. His men exhausted and engaged at the front, enemies potentially attacking from the rear, and a fresh French force still uncommitted. He made a decision that has haunted his reputation for 6 centuries. He ordered the execution of the French prisoners, men who had already surrendered, knights and nobles who had been taken captive in the earlier fighting and were being held under guard awaiting ransom, were to be killed. The order provoked immediate resistance from his own men, English knights, who understood perfectly well that the prisoners represented enormous financial value in ransoms, refused at first. Henry had to threaten his own soldiers with punishment before the order was carried out, and even then it was done reluctantly, incompletely. A portion of the prisoners killed, while others were spared by knights who simply refused to murder men in their custody. The reasons for the order are debated. Henry clearly feared that armed prisoners, if the battle turned against England, would rearm themselves and fight. The threat from the rear and the uncommitted French division made the calculation feel desperate. Whether it was strategically justified or a war crime in any meaningful moral sense is a question that does not have a clean answer, and it is to the credit of Henry's contemporary chroniclers that several of them recorded their discomfort with the decision rather than simply praising it. The 3rd French Division did not attack. Why they held back has been debated across centuries. Some accounts suggest their commanders, seeing the scale of the disaster unfolding in the field below, simply lost their nerve. Others suggest internal disagreements over command authority paralyzed the decision-making. Whatever the reason, they watched. The attack on the baggage train turned out to be less significant than initially feared. And the battle, by the time the 3rd Division's moment had passed, was already over in any meaningful sense. The French losses were staggering. The exact numbers, like all casualty figures from medieval battles, are contested by historians, but even conservative estimates put French dead in the thousands. The flower of French nobility, the men who had gambled the night before over which English prisoners they would take, lay dead in the mud of Agincourt. Among the killed were the Constable of France, 3 dukes, 5 counts, and somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men-at-arms and knights, depending on which source one consults. The Duke of Alençon was killed fighting so close to Henry that he reportedly struck the king's helmet and knocked a piece from his crown before being cut down. The Duke of Brabant, arriving late to the battle with only a small escort and desperately wanting to participate, reportedly grabbed a banner and put it on as improvised armor before joining the fight and dying almost immediately. The lists of the French dead read like a roll call of the most important families in France. English dead were remarkably few. Here again, the numbers from contemporary sources require some caution, but the most credible accounts suggest English fatalities in the battle numbered in the hundreds rather than the thousands. The disparity is so extreme that it strains credulity at first encounter, and historians have sometimes wondered whether the English chroniclers were simply patriotic propagandists. But the tactical logic supports it. The Longbow had done the work before the lines ever met. The French arrived at the English position already weakened, disordered, and exhausted. The terrain had done to the French what no English general could have done alone, and the English formation had been essentially defensive for most of the engagement, allowing the French to exhaust themselves in the approach, rather than requiring the English to do the same. Henry walked the field afterward. He was thorough in ways that modern sensibilities might find unsettling. The wounded French left on the field, those too badly hurt to be taken prisoner and held for ransom, were killed. This was standard practice in medieval warfare and was not considered barbaric by the men who did it, though it looks different from a distance of 600 years. Henry then led his army in prayers of thanksgiving. He had survived. His army had survived. They would reach Calais. They would go home. What Agincourt meant in the immediate political aftermath was enormous. Henry returned to England to a reception that bordered on the hysterical. The country had been hungry for this kind of victory. This proof that the martial traditions of England under Edward III and the Black Prince had not died with those kings. The victory was folded almost immediately into religious narrative. Henry had fought on the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispian, and the coincidence became a theological statement, evidence that God favored England's cause, that Henry's questionable claim to the French throne was validated by divine sanction. The clergy helped construct this narrative, and Henry was happy to inhabit it, because a king blessed by God is a very different proposition than a king whose legal claim rests on contested inheritance paperwork. France was devastated in a way that went beyond the body count. The political consequences of losing so much of the nobility in a single morning were profound and long-lasting. The French political structure, already strained by the mental illness of King Charles VI and the factional warfare between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, was left even more fragile by the removal of so many of its leading figures. It created a power vacuum that would take years to fill, and that Henry would exploit with considerable skill in the years that followed. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, 5 years after Agincourt, would make Henry the heir to the French throne and establish him as regent of France. By the usual measure of medieval military achievement, it was an almost incomprehensible transformation of fortune. A man who had marched a sick, outnumbered, exhausted army across northern France in the autumn rain had, within 5 years, made himself the next king of France. He never became king of France in practice. He died in 1422, probably of dysentery, 35 years old, the same disease that had weakened his army before Agincourt finishing what Agincourt had not. His son, Henry VI, inherited both crowns as an infant and proved entirely unable to hold either one. Within a generation, almost everything won at the cost of that field in Picardy had been lost. Joan of Arc would drive the English from most of France. The 100 Years' War would grind on for another 3 decades after Agincourt. The English presence in France would end not with a decisive battle, but with a slow, grinding erosion of position and will. But none of that diminishes what happened on October 25th, 1415, in the narrow field between Agincourt and Tramicourt. It remains one of the most dramatic reversals in military history, a moment when every conventional measure of military strength pointed toward one outcome, and the actual outcome was precisely the opposite. It is tempting to attribute it to genius, to Henry's tactical brilliance, and there is something to that attribution. He chose his ground well. He understood the potential of his archers in a way that the French command did not adequately respect. He had the psychological steadiness to advance when retreating might have seemed more rational, and to wait when attacking might have seemed more heroic. But there is also something to be said for the mud, for the rain that had fallen for weeks, for the French nobility's magnificent certainty that the outcome was already decided, a certainty so complete it prevented them from seeing the field clearly. Wars are decided by many things, and not all of them could be found on the faces of kings or in the calculations of generals. Sometimes they are found in the ground itself, waiting patiently under the feet of armies that have not yet understood what kind of morning they are walking into. The men who camped on that churned, waterlogged French farmland in October of 1415 had no idea they were preparing the instrument of their own destruction. They had done it to the soil with their thousands of feet and their hundreds of horses over the days of their encampment, and the soil remembered, and when the moment came, it held them and would not let them go. An army that cannot move is not really an army, it is a target, and Henry V, standing on the dry grass at the edge of that field with 6,000 hungry, sick, exhausted men and several thousand English bows, was extraordinarily good at hitting targets. The names of the French lords who died that morning are still carved into the stones of Norman churches and the walls of chateaus across a country that does not particularly enjoy remembering the day. England has not forgotten. The English never forget Agincourt. Every school child who has read Shakespeare has heard the speech, the one about a band of brothers, the one that makes the terrible morning in the mud sound almost like something one would choose. Perhaps it was, for the men who survived it. Perhaps survival confers a retroactive meaning on even the worst circumstances, and standing alive at the end of an October day that should have killed you is the kind of thing that stays in a man's chest for the rest of his life, warm and certain, the proof of something he cannot quite name, but does not need to. He was there. He came through. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.